A family tradition that changed. How I saw my mom's some family traditions are heirlooms, passed down with love and pride, and others are shackles. I learned the difference the hard way. It wasn't a holiday or a birthday that changed me, but a simple handshake, a subtle smile, and the realization that my mother wasn't just a victim. She was a general in a secret war, and I was about to become her most valuable soldier. This is a story about a family tradition that changed how I saw my mom. It's a story about revenge, served in secret, with the taste of sweet justice. I used to think my mom, Elaine, was the kind of person who just accepted things. She was quiet, almost invisible at family gatherings, and always a few steps behind. My father, Robert. He was the force of nature, a man whose booming voice filled rooms and whose opinions were gospel. His family, the Graysons, were a dynasty of Texas real estate moguls. For them, loyalty wasn't a choice. It was a birthright. Every year, at the annual Grayson family barbecue, a ceremony called the Passing of the Portfolio took place. It wasn't about money, it was about power. My father's older brother, Uncle Richard, was the one who was supposed to inherit the family's crown jewel, the management of the Dallas commercial properties. Richard was the golden boy, charismatic and universally adored. Robert, the younger brother, forever lived in his shadow. But when their father passed away, Robert used some legal loopholes and wrestled control of the portfolio from Richard. The family never forgave him, but they obeyed him. My mom would just stand by and smile, a perfect, painted smile that never reached her eyes. I saw it as weakness. I was wrong. The passing of the portfolio was a public event, a performative display of Robert's control. He'd stand on a raised platform, a gold-embossed leather portfolio in his hands, and make a grand speech about hard work and the Grayson legacy. The family would clap on cue, their faces a mix of forced admiration and simmering resentment. Richard, now a mid-level executive in Robert's firm, would stand a few feet away, his smile a little too tight, his shoulders a little too slumped. It was a tradition of ritualized humiliation, a yearly reminder of Richard's failure. My mom, in her pristine white dress, would bring out the tray of champagne flutes. She would serve each family member personally, her movements deliberate and graceful. The family believed she was honoring the patriarch, serving the powerful men as a dutiful wife should. But I started to notice things. The way her eyes would flicker to Richard for a split second, a look of shared understanding passing between them. The way her hands, though steady, would always make sure Richard's glass was the first one she handed off. The way she never, ever looked at my father while he was speaking. When I was 16, my father, Robert, had a minor stroke. He survived, but it changed everything. The doctor said it was stress, a wake-up call. Robert acted like he was invincible, but I saw the tremor in his hand when he tried to sign a check. I saw the fear in his eyes, and I saw the flicker of something else in my mom's eyes, a cold, calculating resolve I'd never seen before. That's when the lesson started. Not at 3 a.m. like a thief's training, but disguised as casual activities. My mom, who had never shown an interest in computers, asked me to teach her about cybersecurity. She had me help her set up an encrypted hard drive labeled family photos and explained how to use it to store important documents. Then she showed me a software to scan documents for watermarks and hidden metadata. "You never know when you might need to protect your private information," she'd say, her voice calm and even. But we both knew what she was really talking about. The real education came when she showed me the digital ghost network. It was a file on the hard drive, a simple spreadsheet disguised as a recipe collection, containing the names and contact information of over a dozen women. Each one was a wife of a Grayson family patriarch, a woman who had once stood on that same platform, a woman who had once served champagne, a woman who, just like my mom, was believed to have a perfect painted smile. I learned that every woman in the network going back 20 years had a secret. They weren't just wives, they were spies. They documented every shady deal, every illegal transaction, every instance of emotional and financial abuse. They kept meticulous records, all hidden in plain sight. One woman had a hidden camera in a potted plant at every family gathering. Another had a network of burner phones and a detailed ledger of her husband's illicit affairs. A third, a former paralegal, had been slowly building a dossier of evidence against the Grayson family's entire business operation. My mom taught me the code words. The recipe's delicious meant a new piece of evidence had been obtained. The roses are beautiful meant a meeting was scheduled. The new curtains are a disaster meant the network was at risk. I became her apprentice. My mom, who I thought was just a quiet, submissive wife, was a master strategist, a spy master. I helped her hack into my father's business emails, using the skills I learned in my computer science class at school. I spent my evenings creating fake online personas to communicate with other women in the network, all under the guise of an online book club. Mrs. Peterson, my guidance counselor, thought I was just getting a head start on my college applications, never suspecting that I was actually building a new identity for a woman in the network who needed to disappear. I created 10 new identities that year alone, each with a full social media history and a credible backstory. We saved 2 women that year. One was a young wife whose husband had gambled away their life savings, and another whose husband had been secretly siphoning money from their joint accounts for a mistress. They both left town to care for a sick relative, but in reality, they were living in different cities with new names and new lives thanks to my mom's network. Not everyone made it, though. One woman, a timid librarian, tried to run. Her husband caught her packing and threatened her. She never reached out to us again. Everything went to hell when Robert's father-in-law, a man named George, died. His wife, my Aunt Helen, was an outsider. She wasn't born a Grayson. She was a widow, a former social worker, and she refused to play along. Her husband had a long-standing tradition of giving his wife a single red rose on the day of the passing of the portfolio, a public display of his love and devotion. After his death, his brothers and my father took over. They told Helen that out of respect for her late husband's tradition, she would be required to accept a single red rose from each male in the family at the next annual barbecue. It was a twisted, misogynistic tradition that made her a public spectacle. Helen refused. She sent a formal letter to the family stating that she would not be attending the event. My father, outraged, called a family meeting. He tried to explain the tradition to Helen, using words like duty and honor. But Helen wasn't a Grayson. She wasn't afraid to speak her mind. She showed up at our house 3 days after the funeral, her face pale but her eyes burning with a defiance I'd only ever seen in my mom. She grabbed my mom's hands and squeezed them tight. Mom pulled her inside quickly, her eyes scanning the street before closing the door. The curtains in the living room were already drawn. Helen's whole body shook as she stood in our hallway, her knuckles white. She had bruises on her wrists where someone had held her down. Mom made her sit down and started asking questions in a low, urgent voice. How many people were watching the house? Who had the keys? When did they plan to start the ceremony preparations? Helen answered everything while I brought her a glass of water, wincing as I saw the red marks on her throat. The answers weren't good. My father had assigned shifts, 2 aunts during the day, 2 uncles at night. They had already bought the red roses, the long-stemmed kind that had been used for generations. The date of the barbecue was marked on the kitchen calendar in red ink. They were making Helen help plan her own humiliation, choosing a dress for the event and writing a speech to read. Mom's face went very still as she listened. She excused herself and came back with the encrypted phone we used for network business. Her fingers flew across the screen, sending coded messages. Within minutes, responses started coming in. I recognized some of the code words. The recipe's delicious meant they had new information. The new curtains are a disaster meant the family was suspicious. The roses are beautiful meant a meeting was scheduled. But then Helen said something that changed everything. She didn't want to run. She didn't want a new identity in another state. She wanted to stay and fight the tradition from the inside. She wanted to save other women after her. Mom tried to explain how dangerous that was. The network operated in shadows for a reason. Open defiance meant real consequences, not the fake kind we arranged. But Helen's jaw was set in a way that reminded me of my mom's expression during those late-night lessons. We spent the next 2 hours planning. Helen would go back before they noticed she was missing. She'd play along, act resigned to her fate. Meanwhile, we'd work on a different kind of escape plan, not running, but surviving in plain sight. I gave Helen one of our burner phones, showing her how to hide it in the lining of her purse. Mom wrote down safe words and meeting signals. We'd communicate through the other women in the family, the ones who came to comfort her but were really checking if she needed help. Helen left through the back door as the sun was setting. I watched her walk down the alley, her shoulders straight and her head held high. Mom was already on the phone, activating parts of the network we'd never used before. The next few days were tense. At family gatherings, we had to pretend everything was normal. I served tea to my father while he talked about the ceremony preparations. He seemed pleased that Helen was being so cooperative, helping choose the flowers and writing letters to leave behind. What my father didn't know was that every night Helen was meeting with different network members. A cousin who worked at the courthouse was preparing duplicate deeds. A lawyer in the family was drafting new contracts. Mrs. Haney from the next town over, whose husband had died 15 years ago, sent money through a complex series of transfers. I spent my evenings in the computer lab creating not just one identity for Helen, but three. Each had different backstories and different destinations. We were preparing for contingencies for things going wrong. Mom made me memorize bus schedules to cities I'd never heard of. Day 15 arrived faster than expected. Helen looked thinner when I saw her at a family dinner. The aunts kept her glass filled with tea, watching every sip. She played her part perfectly, speaking in a soft voice about the honor of the tradition. My father patted her hand approvingly. Under the table, Helen pressed a folded paper into my palm. Later in the bathroom, I read her message. They'd moved up the timeline. Someone had seen her near our house. They were suspicious. The ceremony would happen on day 35 instead of day 40. We had 20 days instead of 25. My mom's network went into overdrive. Messages flew back and forth. Safe houses were prepared. Documents were rushed. But we hit a problem. The documents we needed required a notary, and our usual contact had just been arrested for something unrelated. We needed a new plan. That's when Helen surprised us again. She'd been watching, learning. She knew which of Robert's lawyers prepared the legal documents for the portfolio. She knew where they were kept and how they were made. She had a different idea. Instead of faking her signature on a new deed, why not swap out the entire portfolio? Make it look like she was signing over her rights when in reality she was signing over my father's. It was riskier than our usual methods. It required inside help, someone who could access the portfolio storage. Mom was against it, but Helen had already started recruiting. She'd found an ally in an unexpected place, Uncle Richard, the man my father had humiliated for years. Helen had been speaking with him during the long days of confinement, and something had shifted. Maybe it was her defiance, or maybe Richard was simply tired of watching my father's power grow. Maybe he wanted his revenge as much as we did. On day 20, my father announced that Helen would help prepare the legal documents herself to show her acceptance. It was a test. They'd watch her every move, making sure she didn't try to substitute or dilute the contracts, but it also gave us an opportunity. The preparation ceremony took place in my father's home office on day 21. I watched from the doorway as Helen stood at the counter, her movements careful and deliberate. My father supervised every step, his sharp eyes tracking each document. Helen signed. The other brothers formed a semicircle around them, their presence suffocating in the small space. Helen's hands remained steady as she signed each document in the portfolio. The sound of the pen on the paper filled the office, rhythmic and final. She signed each component exactly as instructed, following the protocol that had been established by her father-in-law. My father nodded approvingly at Helen's precision. What the watching brothers didn't notice was Uncle Richard, sitting quietly in the corner, his weathered hands folded in his lap. He appeared to be dozing, but I saw his eyes tracking Helen's movements and the slight tension in his shoulders. He was waiting. The portfolio preparation took 3 hours. Helen handed the signed documents to my father for inspection. He held them up to the light, checking the signatures and the dates. He seemed satisfied. The portfolio went into the locked cabinet where all the ceremonial items were stored. That evening, my mom received a coded message through our network. Uncle Richard had successfully made a duplicate key to the cabinet during his years living in the house. He would make the switch on day 34, the night before the ceremony. We had 13 days to create a fake portfolio that looked identical to the real one. I spent the next week in my high school computer lab after hours. My teacher had given me a key for my advanced placement projects, never suspecting I was creating a fake portfolio. The real portfolio had a distinctive leather cover and a specific font on the documents. I experimented with different combinations of fonts and papers, trying to match both appearance and feel. Mom coordinated with other network members who had legal knowledge. A widow in another state, now working as a paralegal under a false identity, sent detailed instructions through encrypted emails. She'd helped 3 other women fake their identities using similar methods. On day 25, everything started falling apart. Helen sent an emergency signal during a family dinner. I was serving dessert when I noticed her tapping her water glass in the danger pattern we'd established. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, immediate threat. After dinner, I found her message hidden in the bathroom. Someone had seen Uncle Richard near the cabinet at night. They were suspicious. My father had announced that the cabinet would now have 2 guards, and the key would stay on his person at all times. Mom called an emergency network meeting that night. We gathered in Mrs. Haney's basement. 8 women who were supposed to be powerless sat around a folding table. Each had successfully escaped the tradition, but they all remembered the terror of their own countdowns. The discussion grew heated. Some wanted to abort the plan, to get Helen out immediately through our usual channels. Others argued we were too far along, that backing out now would expose the entire network. Mom kept trying to find middle ground, but I could see the strain on her face. Then Mrs. Haney spoke up. She'd been quiet until that moment, but her words changed everything. She revealed that she'd been documenting every ceremony for the past 15 years. Hidden cameras, audio recordings, detailed notes. She had evidence of over 40 forced portfolio transfers, including video of women being physically restrained while signing documents. The room went silent. We'd all known the truth, but seeing the evidence laid out was different. Mrs. Haney explained she'd been waiting for the right moment, the right case to expose everything. Helen's situation, with Uncle Richard as an inside ally, might be that moment, but exposure meant risk. Real risk. Not just for Helen, but for every woman in the network. Some had children in their new lives, careers, and marriages. They'd built entire existences on the foundation of being invisible. Exposure would destroy all of that. The meeting ended without consensus. Mom and I drove home in silence, both lost in our own thoughts. We had 10 days left, and our original plan was compromised. On day 28, my father made another announcement. The ceremony would be public, held at the family temple instead of the house. The entire extended family would attend, over 200 people. He wanted to make an example of Helen's devotion to inspire other young wives. This complicated everything. Our escape plans had relied on the chaos of a house ceremony, the ability to switch bodies in a crowded room. A temple ceremony would have formal procedures, assigned seating, and multiple witnesses. There would be nowhere to hide. Helen's response was unexpected. She embraced the change, telling my father she was honored by the public ceremony. She volunteered to help with preparations, to send invitations, to coordinate with the temple. My father was pleased by her enthusiasm. What he didn't know was that Helen was building her own network within the family. She'd identified the doubters, the ones who attended ceremonies with reluctance. Uncle Richard helped, pointing out which relatives had questioned the tradition privately over the years. I watched Helen work during family gatherings. She was subtle, planting seeds of doubt without seeming to. She'd mention her social work career to the younger aunts, reminding them of her independence. She'd share memories of her late husband, with his brothers, reminding them of his cruelty. She never spoke against the tradition directly, but her words had weight. On day 30, we had a breakthrough. One of Robert's nephews approached Mom at the market. He'd been assigned as one of the night guards but wanted to help. His own wife was an independent businesswoman, and watching Helen's countdown had changed something in him. He offered to be on duty the night before the ceremony. Mom was suspicious at first. We'd learned to be careful about unexpected allies. But the nephew proved his sincerity by revealing that 3 other young men in the family felt the same way. They'd been talking privately, questioning why their wives should be stripped of their identities someday. This changed our options. With inside help among the guards, we could attempt the portfolio switch after all. But we needed a new plan for the temple ceremony itself. Even with a fake portfolio, Helen would need legal assistance afterward to complete the deception. The temple was isolated, far from any lawyer's office. I spent day 31 creating Helen's final identity documents. This time, I made her older, a widow who'd lost her husband. Naturally, the backstory was detailed: where she'd lived, what her husband did for work, how long they'd been married. I aged her photos, adding lines around her eyes and gray streaks in her hair. Mom coordinated with a network lawyer 3 states away. He would declare Helen a partner in a new business venture over a video call using footage we'd prepare in advance. The business registration was already printed, waiting for the official time of partnership to be added. Everything was ready for Helen's new life. But Helen was still focused on something bigger. She'd been recording conversations with family members on the burner phone, gathering evidence of coercion. She wanted what Mrs. Haney had offered: exposure of the tradition. Not just escape, but justice for all the women who hadn't made it out. On day 32, my father tightened security further. Helen was no longer allowed to leave her room except for meals and ceremony preparations. 2 aunts slept in her room at night. The windows were nailed shut. They even removed the bathroom door to prevent privacy. Helen adapted. She used mealtimes to continue her subtle campaign among the family. She spoke about her social work career constantly, wondering aloud whether she would ever be able to return to it. Several aunts began crying during these conversations, though they tried to hide it. Uncle Richard played his part perfectly. He grumbled about the public ceremony, complained about the travel to the temple, and acted every bit the traditional patriarch. No one suspected he'd already made 3 copies of the cabinet key, or that he visited Helen's room each night to check on her when the guards dozed. On day 33, the family held a rehearsal at the temple. Helen walked through each step of the ceremony, practicing her final speech, her last words to her late husband's spirit. She was serene, almost glowing. My father praised her composure repeatedly. I attended the rehearsal as part of the family chorus. We were supposed to chant traditional songs during the ceremony, creating a wall of sound that would mask any final protests. But as I watched Helen practice holding an empty portfolio, I noticed something. Several of the younger relatives weren't singing. They were mouthing the words, but no sound came out. That evening, the nephew who'd offered to help confirmed what I'd suspected: the quiet rebellion was growing. At least a dozen family members were planning to refuse participation in the ceremony. They wouldn't stop it, but they wouldn't help either. It was a small crack in the tradition's foundation. Mom spent that night finalizing escape routes. The temple had 3 exits: the main entrance, a side door near the preparation room, and an old service entrance that was supposedly locked. Our network had scouted each one, timing distances to various safe houses. We had drivers positioned at strategic points, ready to move when signaled. Day 34 arrived with unusual heat. The family buzzed with ceremony preparations. Flowers arrived at the temple: white chrysanthemums for grief and red roses for love. The ceremonial portfolio was cleaned and polished, its leather cover bright against the wood. My father personally supervised every detail. Helen spent the morning writing letters. Tradition required her to leave messages for family members, final words of wisdom and love. But Helen wrote other letters too, hidden between the traditional ones. Letters to the daughters who would be born into the family, letters warning them about the tradition, telling them about the network, and giving them hope. That afternoon, Uncle Richard made his move. During the chaos of preparation, he volunteered to check the ceremonial items one final time. My father, distracted by a problem with the flower arrangements, handed over the key without thinking. It was a moment 2 weeks in the making. The switch took less than 30 seconds. Uncle Richard had practiced the movement dozens of times. Out came the real portfolio. In went our substitute. The portfolios were identical, down to the gold embossing I'd carefully reproduced. He locked the cabinet and returned the key before anyone noticed his absence. But we'd underestimated my father's paranoia. That evening, he announced a final test. Helen would read a small portion of the portfolio during the sunset prayers to prove her commitment. Not enough to transfer control, just enough to show willingness. The actual ceremony would still happen tomorrow, but this would silence any doubters. The family gathered in the temple as the sun set. Helen knelt before her late husband's portrait, the portfolio in her hands. I stood with the chorus, my heart hammering. We hadn't planned for this. A reading from the real portfolio would be enough to expose her plan, possibly enough to harm her standing in the family. Helen raised the portfolio to her lips. The temple fell silent. Even the children seemed to hold their breath. But just as the portfolio touched her lips, Uncle Richard collapsed. The old man fell hard, clutching his chest. Someone screamed. The portfolio slipped from Helen's hands, shattering on the stone floor. The papers spread across the tiles, a dark stain that seemed to grow in the dying light. Chaos erupted. Family members rushed to help Uncle Richard. Someone called for a doctor. My father shouted for order, but no one listened. Helen was pushed aside in the confusion, forgotten momentarily as everyone focused on the medical emergency. Mom and I exchanged glances across the room. This wasn't part of our plan. But Uncle Richard, even as relatives fanned his face and checked his pulse, managed to catch my eye. The slightest wink told me everything. He'd created the perfect distraction. The paramedics arrived within minutes. Uncle Richard was loaded onto a stretcher, an oxygen mask over his face. He gestured weakly for Helen to come close. Everyone leaned in to hear his final words to his sister-in-law, but the old man was a better actor than any of us had guessed. He gripped Helen's hand and pulled her down, whispering something that made her eyes go wide. Then he was wheeled away, several family members following the ambulance to the hospital. My father stood among the scattered papers and broken portfolio, his face a mask of fury. The ceremony was ruined, the portfolio was gone. The sun had set, making it inauspicious. To prepare more until morning, he ordered everyone to return home to gather again at dawn for the delayed ceremony. As we filed out of the temple, I noticed something crucial. In the chaos, Helen had disappeared. Her assigned guards were busy cleaning up the mess, arguing about who was responsible for the disaster. No one had seen her slip out the service entrance, the one our network had quietly unlocked that morning. Mom and I drove home in tense silence, both of us checking our phones constantly. No word from Helen, no signals from the network. Uncle Richard was reportedly stable at the hospital, his heart episode keeping half the family occupied. But where was Helen? The answer came at midnight, a coded message through 3 different network channels. Helen was safe, but she hadn't run. She was hiding in the temple itself, in a storage room behind the altar. Uncle Richard had told her about it during their whispered exchange, a place he'd discovered decades ago. Helen's message was clear. She would not run. Tomorrow, she would appear at the ceremony as expected. She would transfer the portfolio in front of everyone, but this time the entire family would know the truth about what they were witnessing. Mom tried to talk her out of it. The substitute portfolio would expose her plan and might still harm her standing in the family. The fake identity substances were safer, tested, but Helen had made her choice. She wanted the family to see her, transfer the portfolio, and then rise again. She wanted them to know that every ceremony they'd witnessed might have been a lie. We had less than 6 hours until dawn. The network mobilized for one final push. Mrs. Haney prepared her evidence for release. The women who'd escaped years ago made videos revealing their survival. Uncle Richard, from his hospital bed, recorded his own testimony about the wives he'd helped escape. I spent those hours in the computer lab, uploading everything to secure servers. We created an automated system. If Helen didn't input a code every 12 hours, all the evidence would be sent to every family member's email, phone, and social media. The tradition would be exposed whether my father wanted it or not. As dawn approached, I thought about all the women who hadn't made it out. The timid librarian, the young wife whose husband gambled away their life savings, the paralegal who never got to use her new identity. Tomorrow, Helen would transfer the portfolio for all of them, and one way or another, the tradition would never be the same. The sun rose on day 35, painting the sky the color of blood and gold. The family gathered once more at the temple, subdued, after yesterday's chaos. My father had spent the night preparing new documents, testing them himself to ensure their potency. The ceremonial portfolio had been replaced, this one with a silver emblem. Helen arrived in a white dress, her hair pinned up with gold combs that had belonged to her late husband's first wife. She looked pale but determined, her hand resting protectively on the portfolio. The guards flanked her closely, having been scolded thoroughly for losing her. The ceremony began with the traditional chants. This time, even fewer voices joined in. The rebellion had grown overnight. Family members were disturbed by Uncle Richard's collapse, by Helen's quiet dignity, and by their own consciences finally awakening. Helen served tea to each of her late husband's relatives, her movements graceful despite her exhaustion. Some could barely meet her eyes as they accepted the cup. Others gripped her hands, their faces twisted with an emotion they couldn't name. My father watched it all with cold satisfaction. Finally, the moment arrived. My father himself carried the portfolio to Helen, ensuring there would be no accidents this time. The silver emblem seemed to glow in the morning light. The temple fell silent except for the sound of breathing and the distant call of birds. Helen took the portfolio with both hands. She looked around the room, meeting as many eyes as she could. Then she spoke, her voice carrying clearly through the temple. She thanked her late husband for choosing her. She thanked the family for their support. She spoke of the honor of joining her husband's legacy. But then she kept talking. She mentioned the timid librarian, how beautiful she'd looked in her final moments. She recalled the young wife's devotion, trying to run only because she'd been confused with grief. She named every woman who had signed a portfolio, praising their sacrifice. With each name, the family grew more uncomfortable. These women weren't supposed to be remembered individually. They were supposed to blur together into a tradition, a beautiful custom. But Helen made them real again. She gave them back their faces and their stories. My father cleared his throat, a warning. Helen smiled and raised the portfolio to her lips. The family leaned forward. Some of the aunts were crying openly now. My father's nephews stood rigid, their faces pale. Helen opened the portfolio, revealing the documents within. The family gasped. The documents were a legal transfer of all of Robert's properties and assets to his brother, Richard. The power dynamic of the family had been flipped, and Robert had been completely blindsided. The crowd erupted in gasps, shouts, and murmurs of disbelief. My father stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Helen stood up slowly, her movements shaky but deliberate. She looked around the room at the shocked faces, the tears, the rage, the wonder. Then she spoke, her voice low but clear. She told them about the network, about the women who'd faked their identities, and about the ones who hadn't been so lucky. She spoke of her late husband's cruelty, his previous wives, the bruises hidden beneath white dresses. She told them everything. Some family members tried to leave, but found the temple doors locked from the outside. The network had planned for this too. They would all hear the truth whether they wanted to or not. Uncle Richard arrived then, wheeled in by a network member disguised as a nurse. He added his testimony, confessing to helping women escape over the years. He named each one, described their final moments, the way they'd begged for their lives. The evidence played on a screen someone had set up during the chaos, videos of ceremonies, audio of women pleading, and documents showing property transfers after each death. The tradition's true face was revealed in undeniable detail. By the time the doors were unlocked, the family was in pieces. Some wept for daughters and sisters they'd helped transfer their assets. Others raged at my father, at the tradition, and at themselves for participating. A few still clung to the old ways, insisting Helen's rebellion was a trick, but the damage was done. Within hours, the story spread through the extended family network. Other branches faced their own reckonings as wives appeared at ceremonies very much alive. The tradition that had humiliated hundreds began to crumble from within. Helen left, the temple supported by Mom and me. She was weak but triumphant, her head held high despite everything. We drove her to a network safe house where a lawyer waited to check her over. She would rest for a few days, then disappear into her new life. But first, she had one more task. That evening, she recorded a video message for all the daughters who would be born into the family. She told them they were free. The tradition was broken. They would never have to worry about their husband's greed or stare at legal documents. The aftermath of Helen's rebellion sent shockwaves through the temple. Family members scattered in different directions, some rushing toward her, others backing away. I helped steady Helen as she struggled to stand, her legs weak from the substitute portfolio's effects. Mom positioned herself between Helen and my father, who remained frozen near the altar. Uncle Richard directed operations from his wheelchair, pointing out which exits to use. The network members who'd locked the doors now opened specific routes, creating controlled chaos. Helen leaned heavily on my shoulder as we moved toward the side entrance, but my father's voice cut through the noise. He demanded everyone stop, his authority cracking but not yet broken. Several older uncles moved to block our path, torn between tradition and what they'd just witnessed. Helen straightened despite her weakness, facing them directly. She placed one hand protectively over her stomach and waited. The standoff lasted only moments. My father's nephew, the one who'd offered to help, stepped between the uncles and Helen. Two more young men joined him, then their wives. A human corridor formed, family members choosing sides without words. The older uncles hesitated, outnumbered, and uncertain. Mom guided us through the corridor, while behind us, arguments erupted. My father's shrill commands mixed with younger voices demanding answers. Someone mentioned calling the police, but Uncle Richard shut that down quickly. This was family business, he reminded them. No outsiders. We reached the network van parked behind the temple. The driver, one of Mrs. Haney's contacts, had the engine running. As we helped Helen inside, I saw more family members streaming out of the temple. Some headed for their cars, others stood in small groups, gesturing wildly. The tradition's fracture was visible in real time. The safe house was 40 minutes away, a nondescript apartment above a flower shop. The network had used it for 3 other escapes. Helen dozed fitfully during the drive, her color slowly returning. Mom made calls, activating the next phase of our plan. At the apartment, a lawyer was waiting. He checked Helen's legal documents, monitored the new partnership, and started the process of transferring the new assets. The substitute portfolio had done its job, creating dramatic symptoms without lasting harm. Helen would need rest, but both she and her new identity were stable. While Helen recovered, the network moved into high gear. Mrs. Haney's evidence packages were being assembled, ready for distribution. The automated system I'd set up was armed and waiting. If Helen didn't enter her code by midnight, everything would be exposed. Mom's phone buzzed constantly with updates from family members. The temple gathering had dissolved into chaos. My father had retreated to his house with his most loyal supporters, but cracks were showing even there. 3 aunts had refused to help with the new contracts for a woman who wasn't powerless. My father's brothers were arguing about property, rights, suddenly uncertain if his previous wives had really transferred their assets. Helen woke in the early afternoon, immediately asking about the plan. We showed her the prepared evidence, the testimonies from escaped women, and the documentation Mrs. Haney had collected. She reviewed everything carefully, occasionally suggesting additions or corrections. The decision to release the evidence wasn't just Helen's to make. Every woman in the network had to agree, knowing it would change their lives forever. Mom coordinated a conference call with 12 escaped women. Some had been invisible for over a decade, with new families who knew nothing of their past. The debate was intense but brief. The vote was unanimous. They were tired of hiding, tired of knowing other women were still being humiliated. The evidence would be released, but strategically, not to law enforcement or media, but to every family member under 40. Let the younger generation decide what to do with the truth. I spent the afternoon fine-tuning the distribution system. Email addresses, phone numbers, and social media accounts. We had been collecting contact information for years. The packages would go out simultaneously, impossible to stop once started. Each one contained videos, documents, and a simple message. The tradition is a lie. Your aunts, sisters, and daughters may still be free. As evening approached, Helen made a decision that surprised us all. She wanted to send one last message to my father before disappearing. Not a confrontation, but a simple photo of herself holding a new legal document, proof that she and her new partnership had survived. Mom argued against it, worried about giving my father any clue to track Helen, but Helen insisted. She wanted my father to know that his control was broken, that the tradition had failed. We compromised by routing the message through multiple anonymous servers, impossible to trace back. The photo was simple but powerful. Helen, still pale, but clearly alive, cradling the new legal document, showing her healthy new business. No words were needed. The image itself was a declaration of victory. At 11:47 p.m., Helen entered the code to stop the automatic release. Then, at exactly midnight, she entered a different code. The evidence packages began sending immediately. Across 3 states, phones buzzed and computers chimed as family members received the truth about their dead relatives. The network had prepared for various reactions, but the reality exceeded expectations. Within an hour, Mom's phone was flooded with calls from family members. Some were angry, accusing us of lies and trickery. Others were desperate, asking about specific relatives, hoping their loved ones might still be alive. The most surprising, calls came from the middle generation, people in their 40s and 50s who'd grown up with the tradition but hadn't yet faced it personally. Many had suspected something, had noticed inconsistencies over the years. The evidence confirmed their doubts and gave them permission to act. By dawn, the family was in open revolt. My father's house, once the center of power, became a site of confrontation. Daughters demanded answers about their mothers. Sons questioned their father's traditions and the wives who'd followed. The tradition's careful structure collapsed under the weight of revealed truths. Helen watched the updates from the safe house, her expression mixing satisfaction with sadness. Not every woman had escaped. The evidence included confirmation of real coercion, women who'd been caught trying to run or who'd never found the network in time. For every successful escape, there were others who hadn't made it. The lawyer cleared Helen to travel on day 36. Her new identity was ready. Documents perfect down to the smallest detail. She would be Catherine Haney, a lawyer, from California moving to start fresh. The backstory was solid, the paper trail complete. Even her social media history had been carefully crafted over months. Mom and I drove Helen to the bus station. She wore a wig that changed her appearance dramatically and colored contacts that altered her distinctive eyes. In her purse were $3,000 cash, a prepaid phone, and the contact information for network members in her destination city. The goodbye was brief by necessity. Long farewells attracted attention. Helen hugged us both, whispering thanks that didn't begin to cover what we'd all risked. Then she boarded the bus, just another traveler heading somewhere new. I watched until the bus disappeared around a corner, carrying Helen toward her new life. Mom drove us home in silence, both of us processing the magnitude of what had happened. The tradition was broken, at least in our family branch, but the work wasn't over. The following days brought a cascade of revelations. Uncle Richard, fully recovered from his fake heart episode, became an unexpected leader in the family reformation. He used his age and status to protect younger family members, who spoke out against the tradition. When my father tried to reassert control, he found his influence had evaporated. Some family members clung to the old ways, insisting the evidence was fabricated. They held smaller ceremonies, trying to continue the tradition, but without unanimous family support. These attempts felt hollow. Young wives refused to participate. Husbands faced questions from their children about why mommy should have to transfer her assets if daddy got sick. The network adapted to its new reality. Some women chose to reveal themselves, reuniting with children they'd left behind. Others maintained their new identities, building on the lives they'd created. The safe houses remained active, now helping women from other family branches who'd heard whispers of escape. Mrs. Haney's evidence collection became a template for documenting other harmful traditions. Women from different communities reached out, sharing their own stories of forced transfers and inherited oppression. The network expanded, connecting survivors across cultural lines. I returned to school, but everything felt different. My computer science skills, honed creating fake identities, earned me recognition from teachers who had no idea how I'd really developed them. College applications asked about challenges I'd overcome, and I wrote essays that danced around the truth. Mom continued coordinating the network, but openly now. She helped reunite families, facilitated difficult conversations, and provided resources for women still trapped in dangerous situations. Our home became a way station for women in transition. a place to rest between their old lives and new ones. 3 months after Helen's escape, we received a package with no return address. Inside was a legal document showing a new business partnership. On the back, in Helen's handwriting, it simply said, "She's free." No signature was needed. We added the document to our collection, another life saved from the tradition. The family gatherings changed dramatically. Without the specter of the portfolio ceremony, relationships shifted. Couples talked more openly about finances and choice. Some marriages ended when women realized they'd stayed out of fear rather than love. Others grew stronger, built on mutual respect rather than ownership. My father isolated himself, surrounded by the few relatives who still believed in the old ways. His house, once the center of family power, became a museum to a dying tradition. Younger family members visited out of duty, but his influence was gone. The fear that had sustained his authority had evaporated with Helen's rebellion. On the first anniversary of Helen's escape, the network held a quiet celebration. 14 women who were supposed to be powerless gathered in Mrs. Haney's basement. They shared stories, compared new lives, and remembered those who hadn't made it. Helen didn't attend. It was still too dangerous, but she sent a video message. In it, she thanked everyone who'd helped her escape. She showed glimpses of her new life, a small apartment, a job at a local library, her new business taking its first steps. She looked different, older, wearing glasses, her hair a different color, but her eyes held the same determination that had carried her through those 40 days. The tradition didn't die overnight. Other family branches continued the ceremonies, and women still signed. But word spread through whispered conversations and careful messages. The network grew, reaching women we'd never imagined we could help. Each escape built on the last, refining methods and expanding possibilities. I graduated high school with honors. My college applications were strengthened by a portfolio of design work that showcased technical skills beyond my years. Teachers wrote recommendation letters praising my dedication and creativity, never knowing they were commending abilities developed in life or death situations. The summer before college, I created my last fake identity, not for an escaping woman, but for a young woman from another family who'd heard about our network. Her husband was dying of cancer, and his family had already started discussing ceremony preparations. We gave her a new name, a new life, and a chance to grieve without losing her identity. As I packed for college, I found the legal document Helen had sent of her new business. The new business's name was Bright and Curious, looking at a world where she'd never have to worry about anyone's greed or memorize legal documents. She was free from the moment of her new identity, the tradition's chain broken before it could bind her. Mom drove me to campus, the car loaded with normal college, supplies that felt strange after years of secret phones and forged documents. We didn't talk about the network during the drive, but I knew she'd continue the work. There were always more women who needed help, more traditions that demanded resistance. At the dormitory, surrounded by other freshmen worried about classes, and roommates, I felt the weight of secrets that would never fully leave me, but also pride. We had saved lives, exposed lies, and broken a tradition that had humiliated for generations. Not completely, not everywhere, but enough to matter. That night, I got a text from an unknown number. Just 2 words. Thank you. I knew it was Helen, reaching out one last time before cutting the final connection to her old life. I deleted the message immediately, protecting her safety, as we'd always done. College opened new worlds, but I carried the lessons of those years with me. In sociology classes discussing cultural traditions, I understood the weight of inherited practices. In ethics debates about family loyalty versus individual rights, I knew the real cost of choosing sides. In women's studies, courses examining systemic oppression, I recognized patterns I'd lived through. The network evolved without my daily involvement. Younger women took over the technical aspects, creating more sophisticated systems for documentation and escape. The evidence Mrs. Haney had collected became part of academic studies on harmful cultural practices. Scholars cited our work without knowing the full story of how it was gathered. 5 years later at my college graduation, I saw a familiar face in the crowd. It was one of the aunts we'd helped escape, living openly now under her real name. She'd reclaimed her life after a decade of hiding, reuniting with her children and building new relationships. She smiled at me across the crowd, a silent acknowledgement of our shared history. The tradition still existed in pockets, but its power was broken. Too many people knew the truth. Too many women had survived to tell their stories. What had once been a source of pride for families like ours became a mark of shame, a reminder of generations of unnecessary humiliation. I started graduate school in social work, driven by the knowledge that there were other traditions, other families, and other women who needed what our network had provided. The skills I'd learned creating fake identities translated into helping people navigate legal systems and bureaucracies. The connections I'd made became resources for those seeking escape from different kinds of oppression. Mom aged gracefully, her hands steady now when she held a pen. The fear that had haunted her marriage disappeared, replaced by a partnership built on equality. My father, freed from the burden of knowing his tradition would mean my mom's loss of identity, became more present in their relationship. They traveled, something Mom had never dared dream of before. On quiet evenings, I sometimes thought about all the women whose names we'd changed, whose identities we'd faked, whose lives we'd saved. Each one was living proof that traditions could be broken, that inherited cruelty wasn't inevitable. They were teachers and nurses, mothers and daughters, all existing in defiance of a practice that had tried to erase them. The network's work continued, expanding beyond our family to help women, trapped in different but equally deadly traditions. We shared resources, strategies, and hope with groups fighting forced marriages, honor killings, and other practices that treated women as property rather than people. Each success built on the last, creating ripples of change. Helen's new business would be 7 years old now, the same age I was when I first saw my mom's perfect painted smile. But she would never witness such a ceremony. For her, the tradition would be nothing more than a strange story from the past, a reminder of how things used to be before her mother's courage changed everything. The work wasn't finished. It might never be completely done. But every woman who walked free instead of signing away her rights, every daughter who grew up without fearing her husband's mortality, every family that chose love over tradition was a victory. We had proven that inherited cruelty could be stopped, and that networks of care could overcome systems of control. As I prepared for my first day as a licensed social worker, I kept a photo on my desk. Helen holding her new legal documents, alive and defiant. A reminder that sometimes the greatest rebellion is simply refusing to be invisible when tradition demands it. Her survival had sparked a revolution that saved countless lives. The tradition that had defined my childhood was broken. Not through grand gestures or public campaigns, but through quiet resistance and careful planning. Through women helping women, through secrets shared in coded words, and through the patient work of creating new possibilities. We had inherited humiliation and chosen life instead. Subscribe for more videos.